Resuming debate, reprise de débat. The honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I'm rising today to offer some of the arguments in support of the NDP's motion today that's designed to try and bring some clarity to the scandal that's been dominating Canadian politics for the last couple of weeks, where it's alleged that senior officials in the Prime Minister's office put pressure on the now former Attorney General to reach a deferred prosecution agreement with SNC-Lavalin with respect to bribery charges. I think the charges, or the allegation is that they spent almost $50 million bribing officials in Libya in order to get contracts there. And so, I mean, I think everybody is agreed, I think, that it would be inappropriate for the Prime Minister and his office to lean on the Attorney General to decide not to pursue criminal charges against a particular individual or corporation. That's a long-standing and well-respected principle of Canadian, not just Canadian politics, but Canadian law, Madam Speaker, and certainly not one that we would want to see any deviation from. But there's a couple things that have posed a barrier to being able to get straight answers. One is the Prime Minister repeatedly saying that the discussions between the former Attorney General and the PMO are protected by solicitor-client privilege. And so our motion calls for the Prime Minister to waive that and put it beyond any shadow of a doubt that the former Attorney General has the freedom to be able to express her views as to what happened so that Canadians can judge for themselves whether there was anything inappropriate going on. And the second aspect of our motion, beyond just waiving the solicitor-client privilege, is to have a full public inquiry. Now, Canada has seen this before, particularly in instances of Liberal governments whose sense of entitlement got the better of them. This seems to be one of those situations, Madam Speaker, and we think that a public inquiry would be the best way for Canadians to be able to judge whether or not that is in fact the case. Now, I'll come back to this. So I apologize if I end up repeating some of my remarks, but I know I have heard, particularly from a number of the Liberal members who have decided to engage in today's debate, reference to some investigations that are already ongoing. One is by the Ethics Commissioner, at the request of the NDP, in fact, although the Ethics Commissioner did choose to use a different section of the Act than the one we had originally requested. One that does not, in and of itself, necessitate any public reporting on what may or may not have happened. The second investigation that's currently happening, if we can call it an investigation, I'm a little leery to do so because, well, it's happening at the Justice Committee, and of course the government has a majority of members on the Justice Committee who have refused to invite a number of key witnesses. Now, things have changed a little bit today based on a Justice Committee meeting, and I won't pretend to be apprised of all those details. I'm not on the committee, I wasn't there, but I do know there are a number of key witnesses that so far the committee has said it doesn't wish to hear. Essentially, Madam Speaker, the point that I'm driving at is that the scope of any one of those two investigations is sufficiently narrow that Canadians aren't going to get a real picture into the relationship between the current government and SNC-Lavalin and what did or didn't happen between the PMO and the former Attorney General. Those are the questions that, it's very clear Canadians are interested to know the answer to. It's going to say a lot ultimately about the character of this government in terms of how they chose to conduct their business with respect to this charge, and whether the PMO thought it was appropriate or that they had any right to interfere in that process, I think will say a lot about this government, Madam Speaker. So it's important that we get to the bottom of it, and a full public inquiry at this point is the way to do it. We've seen that government members on the Justice Committee want to constrain the scope of the study to not get at the core matter of the issue. And while the Ethics Commissioner does have important work to do within his mandate doesn't include enough scope to capture that whole picture. And so that's why a public inquiry is warranted, Madam Speaker. I'd add at this point, for those listening at home, if they're experiencing a sense of frustration, that we're talking about the extent to which government is willing to go to protect its insider buddies, instead of talking about whether they've had a fair CPP increase in the last year or two, or whether they have good access to healthcare services close to home, or whether the affordability crisis in Canada is being addressed, whether that has to do with housing or the cost of prescription drugs, or whether, whether they're frustrated because we're not talking about the imminent and catastrophic effects of climate change, that I share their frustration. I do. That's what I ran in order to be able to come to Ottawa to talk about. But what I would say to those people who are feeling that sense of frustration at home, to kind of explain why it is important that we address this issue, is that all the conversation in the media and in the House over the last number of weeks isn't the distraction that we need to be concerned about. This discussion is symptomatic of the fact that the government has been distracted from dealing with those serious issues, because there's only so many people in government, there's limited time, there's limited resources, and they have clearly been dedicating a lot of their resources to look out for their corporate buddies. They've had a number of meetings, and I won't repeat all the statistics that have been said in this place today, but we know that there's been dozens of meetings with the PMO that have to do with SNC-Lavalin, never mind other companies, Madam Speaker. And then a number of those have been under the rubric justice and law enforcement, which is interesting that they would be meeting with the government on such issues, given that they're effectively a construction company, Madam Speaker. We know why they were. We're getting a better picture of why they were, but we need a public inquiry to have the whole picture, Madam Speaker. So I share that frustration, but I would say to Canadians that the problem is that the distraction to this point hasn't been with the business in the chamber. It's been that the government has been preoccupied with looking out for those people, and for all sorts of reasons. I don't know. I raised before the story broke in the Globe and Mail on the Wednesday of our last sitting week, Madam Speaker, about potentially inappropriate communications between the Prime Minister's office and the former Attorney General. I was standing up in this place during question period raising the issue of a former SNC-Lavalin executive who had pleaded guilty to subverting Canada's political financing laws to make donations, illegal donations, to the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party, Madam Speaker. So, we know that this is going on. We know there's a cozy relationship there. We know it's a relationship that is particularly acute in the case of this government. But, in the last government, they essentially privatized all the nuclear assets of the country under AECL. They transferred them to a new shell company called Canadian Nuclear Laboratories. That's being run by a consortium that includes SNC-Lavalin. And we're talking billions and billions of dollars of assets, Madam Speaker. There's a project ongoing right now, Madam Speaker, to rejig, reform, if you will, or change, alter a central heating and cooling plant in downtown Ottawa, and ultimately privatize the operations of that plant, which up to now has been successfully run by the public sector. And one of the major members of the consortium that is going to be operating that plant is SNC-Lavalin. This is a company with their fingers in many pots that has a former executive that has pleaded guilty to funneling money to the Liberal and the Conservative Party. And unfortunately, this is the kind of thing that promotes a lot of cynicism about politics. So yeah, it's frustrating for me to be standing here addressing those issues. It's something I wish didn't happen. I wish it wouldn't happen. But it's not going to stop happening unless we get serious about accountability for the people that are allowing it to happen. Now, there's legal accountability. And one of the things that we're upset about today is that, the law changed to make SNC-Lavalin accountable for the bad deeds that it's doing in other countries. Libya is the example here because that's where the bribery that is alleged to have taken place happened or is alleged to have happened, and that's precipitating these charges. But Canadian law changed a number of years ago in order to be able to prosecute Canadian companies, to put them on their best behavior internationally. If that's I haven't heard anybody today say that they want to rethink that. And that's right and that's good. We should be holding Canadian companies to Canadian standards and have them be good ambassadors for Canada and conducting business well across the country. So, but the problem is that now that the law has changed, that's how you get accountability for companies, is to make them compliant with the law when they refuse to be. They went to government and they lobbied government not to change that law. I think they knew, because it wasn't on. I mean, who would get up in this place? I invite anyone who thinks they can or should to get up and say, you know, we're okay if Canadian companies want to go ahead and bribe governments. I don't think anybody's going to make that case today. So instead of changing that law, because that's a good law, they said, why don't we change the law to allow us an out? Instead of being accountable under the law, instead of suffering the consequences of the law when we've broken it, we'd like a way out. And that's what the deferred prosecution agreement was. The Liberals snuck that into an omnibus budget bill so that it didn't get the attention that it deserved. And then the allegation is that the Prime Minister's office, once that was in place, got involved to try and get the Attorney General on board with having one of those agreements instead of prosecuting the criminal charges. So there's no question. SNC-Lavalin is one of those wealthy insider company that's getting special treatment. When the law didn't work for them, the Liberals were willing to change the law. And when even that wasn't working, then they appear to have been willing to exert political influence and political pressure in order to make it work. And I don't think that's the way Canadians want to see their government work, and I don't think it's the way, frankly, that they want to see their corporate culture work either. I think, you know, Canadians, when we think of ourselves as competing on the world stage, we think of ourselves as being a good actor that, in addition to going out and making money, as Canadian companies do internationally, that we're also doing that and setting an example at the same time of companies that are following the law and abiding by appropriate rules and competing based on the rules and winning at that competition. I think we want to think that that's what our companies are out there doing, and we want a legal regime that supports that, and we don't want our government circumventing it. I mean, we saw something similar with KPMG when there was a large scandal revealed that they had been helping people avoid paying what they owed in taxes, frankly, Madam Speaker, through any number of different ways. And instead of, like most Canadians, when they get into trouble with the CRA, being, you know, dogged until they paid all the money back with interest, KPMG got a sweetheart deal that made it go away. And what's going on here is some unearthing of the process by which that happens. And it's ugly, it's messy, it's what people, I think, know are happening in other places but expect better of Canada and should expect better of Canada. And it's distressing to see the level of complicity that appears to have been not just complicity on the part of the government. I mean, I think we can talk about complicity of Liberal backbenchers, Madam Speaker, but in the case of the government itself, a very active involvement in trying to get special treatment for SNC-Lavalin. I mean, Joe Canadian would love to have that kind of muscle behind his tax return, Madam Speaker. That would be, I'm sure he would appreciate that. We just hosted in my riding an evening with an official from the CRA to talk about what tax credits and benefits constituents are eligible for. And you know, what we heard was a lot of stories of people being really frustrated, not even being able to get a phone call returned by an entry-level CRA employee, never mind getting the Prime Minister's office to talk to the Attorney General about fixing things up for them because, you know, they made a few mistakes and maybe they paid a few tens of millions of dollars in bribes to government officials in order to get work. I mean, the levels of magnitude involved here are totally different, and it makes no sense that your average Canadian would be pursued with the full force of government while people that are playing a much bigger game with higher stakes would get a get out of jail free card, essentially, which is what we're talking about, Madam Speaker. And what we've heard in reply, and I'm not sure if there's some heckling or just side conversations going on, but I've certainly heard the heckle today from Liberal members. Oh, well, you guys must not care about the jobs. And I'll tell you, Madam Speaker, nothing could be further from the truth. I think the NDP has done a great job of advocating for jobs for Canadians in this place. We'll continue to do that. But the idea that somehow when the executives of a company go out and break the law, and there's serious charges, Madam Speaker, we shouldn't be laughing off bribery of public officials. It's not okay. It shouldn't happen. And when the executives of a company go out and do that, they ought to be held to account. And we can work to find a plan for jobs. I mean, I will say of SNC-Lavalin, a lot of the work they do too is subcontracting, Madam Speaker. There's a lot of great construction workers in Canada. And if somebody else gets those contracts, they will be subcontracted to do that work too. So there's core work for SNC-Lavalin. We're concerned about that too. But it can't be an excuse for being able to go around breaking the law. How is that acceptable? On what planet do we think that somehow, because there's a lot of jobs at stake, well, then they can do anything they like? Yeah. Pick a law, Madam Speaker, have them break it. It's okay because they employ a lot of people. So I have a lot of sympathy for those workers, and I do think that if those charges proceed and are ultimately proven in court, and SNC-Lavalin is prohibited, as they should be under the law, for 10 years from federal contracts, that the government will then turn its mind. If they would devote half the energy to figuring out what to do for the SNC-Lavalin employees that will be out of work, as they did trying to get SNC-Lavalin executives off the hook, those workers will be well served because they've clearly put a lot of time and energy into that. They should be thinking about the workers first instead of their corporate buddies first, Madam Speaker, and we wouldn't be in this mess. And as a matter of fact, Madam Speaker, while we talk about the law and jobs, I mean, it's a little rich to hear the government say, we don't care about jobs because we believe in the integrity of the criminal justice system. When there was a law on the books that said Air Canada couldn't outsource its maintenance work, they just changed the law. Where was the concern for the workers in that, Madam Speaker? We had a law protecting those jobs, so they changed it, and they allowed Air Canada to ship that work offshore, Madam Speaker. There's no concern for the workers there. No. And no concern for the law, as a matter of fact. When we talk about the rights, the collective bargaining rights of Canadian workers and concern for workers and their rights, and I think back to the debate we had in the fall for Canada Post workers who wanted to be able to go to the bargaining table and engage in fair bargaining, and early on the government came out and threatened back to work legislation and then followed up with it and got the job done for Canada Post. Where was the concern for workers there? Where was the concern for workers' rights there, Madam Speaker? Once again, they used their legislative powers to put workers down. So it's a little rich for me on this side of the House to today be hearing them say that because we think corporate criminals ought to do their time, somehow we don't care about jobs. These are the same people that when GM said they're going to close the Oshawa plant after it won awards for productivity and good service by GM, they said, that's the market, we can't do anything about it. That's the market. So when that happens in the market, they're powerless to help workers, they're powerless to lean on companies. But if a corporate executive breaks the law, well, no, then they're not powerless. They can do something about that. They can change the law to make deferred prosecution agreements possible, and then the PMO can go ahead and lean on the Attorney General. If that's not what happened, then let's have the public inquiry and figure that out. Exactly. But we've got credible career reporters in the Globe and Mail saying they understand that that's what happened, and I think we have no good reason to take the Prime Minister at his word that it didn't. If it comes down to, a well-documented article by the Globe and Mail and Robert Fife or the PM's good word, you'll excuse me if I side with the Globe and Mail on this one, Madam Speaker. They want to talk about workers when Via Rail just recently awarded a contract not to a Canadian company that's qualified to build those rail cars, but to a German company that's going to produce them in the US. They said, that's the market, there's nothing we can do. So, let's all get on the same page here, Madam Speaker, and be really clear. A government that really cared about workers and jobs in this country wouldn't only care when it's their corporate buddies who have pled guilty to skirting election financing laws to pad their political pocket. That is not the only time they would care about jobs if that's what they really cared about. So I think it's pretty clear to Canadians where the real priorities of this government lie. I think this developing story is putting that in evidence, Madam Speaker, and I think a public inquiry, if it's not the case, is the way to clear the air, and all members of this House should support a public inquiry to get to the bottom of it. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Government to the Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
So I thank the member from Elmwood-Transcona for his contribution to today's debate, and just want to clarify a couple of things. In putting aside the notion that we're not concerned with jobs independent of the lowest unemployment rate in 41 years and the fact that we've created 800,000 jobs, I think it's important to clarify 715.34 sub 1 of the Criminal Code, which actually addresses the remediation agreements that we're speaking about, that he was speaking about, talks about requiring an admission of guilt, forfeiture of any benefit, payment of a penalty, payment of restitution, implementing a change of behavior, and cooperating with any further investigation. I think that needs to be clearly stated for the record. The second thing is that the member opposite, if I heard him correctly, said the ethics investigation is too narrow. What the ethics investigation actually allows for is the power of the commissioner to summon witnesses, require those witnesses to give evidence orally in writing under oath or affirmation, produce any documents or things that are necessary, and in these investigations and in this format, the commissioner has the same powers as a court of record. And the question I would put to the member opposite is that given that mechanism, given those significant powers, I would put it to him that that is precisely why his party initiated an ethics investigation and why it was agreed to on the part of the ethics investigator. Or is that no longer the member opposite's position? Does he question the validity of that process and the independence of the ethics investigator? Thank you.
The honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, as I mentioned earlier in my speech, I mean, we're not saying that the ethics commissioner's investigation shouldn't take place, nor have we ever questioned the independence of the ethics commissioner. That's just not on, so I don't know where the member heard that. But our concern is that the scope is narrow, and I'm not prepared to cite the sections of the Act, but I do know that we had requested an investigation under one section of the Act that would require public reporting. The section of the Act under which an investigation is being pursued, and it is the Ethics Commissioner's right to pursue under whatever clause he would like, but it does not necessarily entail any public reporting, and it's confined to a more limited question, which is whether the Prime Minister, I think, again, I'm not quoting, so was acting to promote the particular interest of an individual, which in this case could also be a company. I think there's a lot more to this when you're talking about the potential firing of a minister and various kinds of political pressure from the Prime Minister's office. And so our position isn't that the ethics commissioner's investigation shouldn't proceed or that there isn't value in it. Our contention is that the scope of it is going to be too narrow because of the section under which it's being pursued, and that there's a lot more questions deserving of a lot more answers than the ethics commissioner is going to be able to pursue within his mandate.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Red Deer Lacombe.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to thank my friend from the NDP. We spent a lot of time on the Ethics Committee together earlier on in this Parliament and did a great job while he was there. He's already elaborated on it a little bit, but if I could just get him to explain a little bit more why the Ethics Commissioner's investigation by itself is certainly nothing to make light of, but it's certainly not going to bring everything to bear with the limited scope. If you could just elaborate on that a little bit more. And if you can elaborate on why, with the shenanigans that are going on right now, my understanding is the Justice Committee is still meeting, it's still in camera. We've got a cover-up that's going on right there. Why it's so important to actually have a public inquiry in order to clear up this mess.
The honourable member for Edmonton-Transcona.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And, I think even just the nature of some of the Justice Committee meetings happening in camera, for instance, which, as everybody here, but maybe people at home don't know, means not public, which means not televised, no public written record of what was discussed. If these important questions are going to be dealt with at the Justice Committee, for instance, and that's going to be happening in camera, that's not enough. So a public inquiry is going to happen in public, but it's also going to have, if the terms of reference are right, and there'll be, if we get to the point where the government feels sufficient pressure to launch a public inquiry, the devil will be in the details of its mandate. I think what we're seeing now is a story that involves the firing of a minister from one particular position, the resignation of that minister subsequently, the resignation of the Prime Minister's principal secretary, a number of different charges with SNC-Lavalin. There is the charge about interference in the public prosecution, but there is also the guilty plea from a few weeks ago to SNC-Lavalin illegally funneling money to the governing party over 6 figures worth. So there's a big and developing story here. So I think the idea that the Ethics Commissioner with a limited scope under its mandate, that investigation is going to be able to accomplish everything that Canadians would like to see answers to is just not realistic. And so then the question is, what is the mechanism or what is the body or what is the tool that's going to be able to achieve that? And only a public inquiry with a satisfactory terms of reference are what's going to be able to accomplish that. And that's why it's important that this motion pass today and that the government respect the motion once passed.